Good morning to all of you here in the room and online. It's very exciting to be here. It's after the introduction presentation by the Deputy Mayor and by Timo, I sort of have mixed feelings. I feel, in a way, I really regret to not have been here 2-3 years ago to collaborate on these plans. And on the other hand, I think it's also an exciting opportunity to collaborate in the future and double down on some of the ambitions that, as Katja mentioned, are so close to the work that we do with Blossity. And it's fascinating to see how thoughtful Turku is laying out that sort of trajectory towards a more inclusive, a more smart future that sort of builds on the legacy, but really is progressive in many ways. So it's a huge honor to be here. I will show some of our international work, and that's just a reference and hopefully sort of a context for further discussion later on. We are Blossity. We are a strategic consultancy based in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, with 4 people. So we're rather compact, and that allows us to work on exciting projects, but also to always keep a very close connection to our clients and to the work and the projects that we do. Marije on the left is the superstar in the team, and I will elaborate on that later on a little bit. We work on cities. We develop strategies and concepts. And our work always centers around transforming pieces of the city into mixed-use environments. And the focus really is on how do you create a place? How do you nudge people and to have that kind of sort of behavior, that level of happiness, if you will, and to really thrive? And so what is sort of the composition of the city and the community to make sure that people really go sort of beyond their normal, typical day? And that's in a way an interesting sort of connection between some of the previous words that have been spoken. We are on the intersection of the built environment and human behavior. And Marije is a sociologist. She's has a PhD in sociology. And we started collaborating together 10 years ago. I'm an urban planner architect by training. Marije has that health science background, and her PhD in sociology allowed us to work, I think, on a deeper level on what cities do for people. I was fed up 10 years ago, hearing architects talk about health and well-being, because I think what I see in the Netherlands in architectural education, I'm a teacher myself, is that there's very little attention to psychology, to sociology, to behavioral sciences. And so we wanted to tackle that. So we started working together, bring that more evidence-based approach into design, and so far that has been really interesting. And I think we need, as designers, we need to get out of that silo and work together with that more scientific approach to not only talk the talk, but really walk the walk if we want to go and double down on good environments. The 2 topics that sort of are a red line in our portfolio center around sort of the war for talent. So what kind of environments attract and retain talent? And the other line, obviously, is everything around health and well-being. So how do we make spaces where people feel better, where they are nudged, influenced to maybe exercise a bit more, have that more healthy lifestyle? And interesting enough, these 2 topics, health and well-being and everything around talent, they come together so often, which you will see in a second. We have quite a strange mixed bag sort of portfolio of clients, and that's a lot of fun. It's very non-linear. We often work with private clients as well as with cities, and we work with clients that are not just looking for designers. We have consciously put ourselves at the very beginning of processes. So we work on strategies, on master plans before something goes into a commission. And we are very happy to hand it over to great architects later on. We use our creativity very early on when the business case is being made, when the political mandate needs to be developed. So it's strategy consultancy on cities. And really trying to bring a more integrated way of thinking into the discourse of city making these days. So I think there are sort of a couple of key trends that I want to show and discuss, and it's sort of trying to get above and beyond the clouds. What we see, first of all, of course, and that is almost an obvious one, is that incredible growth of the middle class globally. And I'm trying to just give a bit of a global framework, where you see huge growth of the middle class in China, in India, but also in Latin America. And that growth, that economic prosperity, is driving huge mobility. So we see that is driving, for example, young students traveling around the world in an incredible pace, where we see that the growth of what we call Generation Erasmus is going on a hyper scale. And that is a question for cities. How do we accommodate that Generation Erasmus? And how do we make sure that our cities are sticky enough? That idea of how do you make sure that the talent is not only coming in for a funded 6 months, but how do you make sure that the innovation surplus sort of drops down in your city and that the talent retains there? So you go from that sort of hypermobile generation to a world of sort of spiky cities. And so you see that cities are the epicenter of talent, and you see an European landscape where there is a lot of competition between cities. And I think that is interesting for cities of all sizes. And we'll speak about some examples in different leagues later on. But this is sort of the framework that we're all in, and where a city as Turku obviously is in. When then you sort of try to, this is then the result of that sort of spiky city landscape. And I didn't dare to include the numbers for 2019, 2020, and 21, because it would sort of go beyond the screen. But we have, this is one of the results, and there are many consequences. And this is something that we need to develop more interesting and more thoughtful strategies for to address that housing crisis. One of the things for me, and that is sort of the last trends that I think I would like to share, is that we see that human pathways are no longer linear. So it's not the case anymore that you go to school, university, you land a job, you buy a house, and you work for 40 years. And you start your company in university. You continue learning when you're a civil servant. You have a flexible housing career where you maybe have a sort of small city apartment that you lease and a place on the countryside. So that is moving from a very linear way of thinking back in the days to much more of a sort of a Jenga tower, where I think we need to retrofit cities to these new behaviors of citizens. So I think it's adapt or die. I mean, it's nothing more than that. We need to go radical into retrofitting cities. And one of the things that fascinates me is what we call university-led urban regeneration. So how do you use universities, and by that I mean that inclusively, higher education, as a means to generate and regenerate certain areas in cities? How do we do that more clever placemaking with students, and how do you sort of add on to all these brilliant minds in your local community? It's interesting to think, to sort of zoom out. So what is then, if we speak about university-led urban regeneration and the role of knowledge in cities, this is an interesting scheme. Anyone recognizes the gentleman here? Walt Disney, wonderful, lovely. So this is Epcot, the experimental prototype community of the future. And Walt Disney actually had a lot of fascinating ideas about communities and cities. He was designing theme parks, and he had a lot of ideas about how cities could look like. He had a bit of a theme park aesthetic to it. I mean, but it's interesting to think. And I mean, and one confession, the other way around, I would still love to design a theme park one day. It would be fascinating. But it's interesting to see that this project got never built. It was his idea to center a city around a theme park. But actually nowadays, we're building this kind of stuff. So if you look globally on campuses, and with campuses I mean could be either a university campus or a corporate campus, this is the UFO by Apple. Had a spaceship in California. And there's more. For some, the sort of subtitle of this talk could also be, why are science parks and campuses circular? Because there's a lot of stuff that has a circular shape. This is the AT&T Bell Labs designed by Saarinen already in '42. This is one of the first business parks in the United States. And it's interesting to think of the name business parks. I mean, these environments always echoed park landscapes, very natural settings. This was a time of suburbanization in the United States. This was the time of the white flight. This is when people were moving out of the cities into their sort of safe, segregated suburbs, and they went to segregated campuses where they could work and be sort of concentrated, have a nice walk in lunch, completely remote. And think of what this does to mobility of all the car traffic, and you see the parking here. Think of what this does in terms of physical activity. How active can you be if you don't, or if you're not able to cycle to work? And this is a model of functional segregation. And we've been designing cities since modern times and trying to pull out, since the early schemes of the modern movement, segregating work, living, learning environments sort of in different zones and cities. And I think it's the right time to start bringing that back. And there's more. I could do an entire talk about US campuses and that sort of suburbanization, the enormous focus on mobility that has been going on since the 50s and still is today. Because it's interesting that you see one part of that discourse is where you see corporates now moving back into cities, and I will show some actual examples in a minute. But you also have that same trend where companies still think it's a good idea to be in that cut off, what they call connected, but that is, I mean, that Apple spaceship is an exclusive environment. It's not open to all. It's a very premium landscape that is just there for their employees. It's not connected to the community. It's not giving anything back. It's not accessible for the people that work there as a janitor. So that's I think it's a way of city development that we should be very thoughtful about, and we should be really critical in a way. So I think today, these days, the city is a campus. I think this is very much true for Turku. So in a way, my talk almost feels a bit obsolete. I think a lot of the interesting things that we see around the world are happening here in a way. But I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff still to enhance and to catalyze. The campus is also a city. And I think that is, for me, sort of one of the drivers in our work. How do we help cities to turn into campuses where talent is not sort of flowing away, where you tackle the brain drain? And on the other hand, how do we turn monofunctional environments, business parks, university campus, how do we turn these into proper cities with all the characteristics and all the mixture that cities actually need? And so let's sort of take this as a starting point for our focus today. I want to show quickly 5 examples of some of the work that we did just to illustrate that. We have been working on a new university in Amsterdam called the Ams Institute. In Amsterdam 10 years ago, the deputy mayor recognized that the 2 good universities that the cities had were running short on engineering talent. So they used the public funding they had from selling off gas shares. They used that to fund, sort of to kickstart a new university. And they did a global competition, MIT Boston, Delft University of Technology, my alma mater, and Wageningen University. They won the competition and started working on a new university in Amsterdam. Very bottom-up, very pop-up in a way. We worked with the team to sort of do that first 2 years of landing in the city, coming up with a first temporary campus, developing partnerships. It's an interesting side note that the first international delegation that we got was a delegation from Helsinki, actually. I think there has always been a lot of interesting collaboration between Finnish education and the Dutch. But this goes to show that you can come up with a new knowledge ecosystem. And you need a bit of investment, but you can start. And this is then, of course, interesting because the university, we only did 2 years. It's a thriving institute nowadays, 5 years, 6 years later. It landed on a new location, and there it really started doing that. University-led urban regeneration started to catalyze urban development. And it's a school that specifically studies urban challenges, so that makes it sort of twice as interesting. But I think it's a soft way of trying to transform the urban fabric and the talent ecosystem in cities. We have also been working in Turin for a bit, and Turin is in Italy, Torino. It's an interesting city. I think it draws some comparisons to Turku. Turin suffers from that brain drain of talent. It has a great polytechnic university, but a lot of young people after graduation, they take the train and move to Milan. And that is an hour, 1.5 hour train ride. So that is sort of that same sort of discourse that you have here with the greater Helsinki region. And what Turin was sort of lacking was a clear positioning. So what is it? What is that combination of the polytechnic and all these corporations? Of course, you have Fiat there with these enormous innovation plans, but there's quite a thriving startup ecosystem. Well, what is the story of the city? And we help them in some sessions with coming up with a new sort of positioning, a new identity on this topic, if you will, really by connecting the dots in between all the small hubs that we found after a lot of field research. And so that's also sort of trying to go into your city, try to map out who's doing what is sort of the story, or what are the stories that you can sort of absorb out of the city. And how do you start to shape a more connected ecosystem in the city that in the end sort of contributes to a more attractive destination? And I think it's interesting to see. I was surprised yesterday to hear some references. Hey, do we want to go Dubai or Paris? I mean, it's a lot of fun, of course, to daydream about these kind of cities, but that's a complete different morphology. That's a different scale. That's a different league of cities. I think looking at examples like Turin or Lyon is probably more insightful. And let's see what kind of best practice we could absorb from these cities and bring them here to Turku. In our work, it goes from very sort of almost regional positioning, storytelling skills, also to the level of the object. And whereas we are not involved in architecture, we help companies, investors, and to make good decisions on where to land. This is an initiative, Katja mentioned it already, the student hotel is a new student accommodation operator in Europe. It's a Dutch firm, has been expanding quite rapidly, and this was one of their sort of pilot projects, transforming an abandoned shopping center in The Hague, which is next to the hotel, into a sort of a co-work space that is not running on your typical sort of co-work model. So how do you, and this is a neighborhood that really deserves some attention. It's a neighborhood where the socio-economic status is uncomparable with other parts of the city, so where that special focus was needed. And how do you create sort of the coffee house of the neighborhood? And how do you organize a mixture between international students at the university that sleep here and immigrants that live in that neighborhood? And how do you create an open to all environment? I think this is, for many, and we had a nice discussion yesterday about it, it's interesting to think about these kind of third places. So what are the spaces which are not parks, but different kind of indoor environments that are in between your home and your office space? And I think especially in COVID times, that is more important than ever. We need that sort of hybrid layer in cities, and to accommodate the fact that we work from home nowadays, but can't always be home, that we cannot always be in the office, but we want to have a space to connect with friends. So we need a new sort of layer of public-private environments in cities to make sure that we accommodate that need. Specifically on campuses, we have been working quite a bit for Nike. Nike has its European headquarters in the Netherlands. That's a site with around 4,000 employees, 8-9 different buildings. And we are working intensely with the local government on transforming the positioning of that place into capital of sport and innovation. So this is a good example of how corporate companies can take an initiative and start to co-create and collaborate on a brand positioning, on a new neighborhood. There's quite a sizable plot of land on the left of campus where we're working together with the municipality in a partnership to develop a new neighborhood. So this quite dull business park slowly transforms into an integrated campus where you have a local school, you have housing for talent, for internationals, for expats, and you start to sort of slowly transform that into an innovation district. So from business park, as we saw at the earlier stages, quite disconnected and suburban, if you will, to much more of an urban. So this is urbanizing sort of this kind of talent infrastructure. Another example, which I think is interesting, is the Siemens global headquarters for Siemens Healthcare. This is southern Germany, and in Erlangen specifically. Well, I had never heard of Erlangen before I started to collaborate with Siemens, but it's the hometown of Siemens, very close to Nuremberg, to München. But it's a place where it's incredibly difficult to attract talent, because it's not Munich, it's not Hamburg, it's not Berlin. It's a small town that has a huge corporate infrastructure, but is not sort of your go-to place if you're a clever a programmer from India, or you are a super bright medical engineer from the Bartlett in London. If you want to go there, it's not a destination. So how do you turn this place into something more attractive? There was this building vacant for over 10 years. It was one of the former administrational head buildings, and had been vacant for a while. And we started to work on a sort of an innovation hub program. And that was sort of an overflow space. It was a third place in a way for the Siemens campus. But it was also an open place for the local community. In that town, you have sort of 80% of the people living there have some kind of family relation with Siemens, obviously. And what is interesting that we didn't only focus on workplace and services, but we integrated a scheme of 200 units short stay. So Siemens understood that if we want to bring talent here, we need to double down on accessibility. So we need to offer something for expats or for trainees and to stay on campus for 6 months or for a year. And that is also another example of sort of rearranging the function of a campus. Interesting because it creates a whole different energy. If you have a normal business park, people pop in at 8 and they leave at 5, or when it's maybe a bit early dark, they leave at 4. But if you have people staying at campus, you get sort of this 24/7 buzz. You get a complete different dynamic on site. And we developed a master plan and brought it up to commissioning to the board. And this is soon going to be developed in conjunction with an international architecture firm. I think the key, are we good on time? Yeah, lovely. I think there are two sort of key concepts, and this is sort of me wrapping up. I think in our approach, and that is something that I think is relevant and applicable to many places, it's about sort of a layered approach. So how do you connect that question around talent, that question around getting the right investment? A huge part of our work is deal making, trying to negotiate public and private interest and trying to bridge the gap very early on between these kind of stakeholders that invest in neighborhoods. And what is the role of urbanism? So what is the spatial component of that discussion? How do we make sure that the discussion is not only Excel sheet driven, but always has sort of a spatial logic to it? That works, that is applicable on a property scale, that's applicable on the scale of the urban campus, and that is also applicable then, it results even to a sticky city. If you do that well, if you connect the dots from these key two levels first, on the building scale and on the spaces in between, on the scale of the city as a campus, that city becomes sticky. It's a place where talent stays and really retains. And then I think the second thing, in that whole cycle of development, so going from a business case to design to construction to operations, it is about an holistic idea about what is your positioning and what is the brand that sets you apart. What is the programming? And programming is spatially, so it's square meters of functions, but it's also the soft programming. It's also what kind of events we organize. And it's about partnerships. I think yesterday we had that talk about how do you incorporate different actors. You don't have to figure out all the services yourself. How do you collaborate with a gym or with a restaurant, a bakery in your neighborhood, and make sure that you pull that together and start to develop an ecosystem? So these things play out on different moments in the cycle. Reality learns that it's more something like this. I would say unfortunately sometimes, but I think that's also what makes it interesting. Trying to connect these dots through the development cycle, I think it should be the aim of our work. I'm going to finish off with just 3 takeaways very quickly. I think start with shaping the spaces in between the buildings. I think we have an obsession for buildings, and we have a logic around investment in property. But the value, the added value, is in the spaces in between. So think about the city, the community as an ecosystem. And then the value drops really in between the buildings. So let's go a little bit further, also in the way we commission projects, in the way we think about zoning. Let's start to think more integrated about the spaces in between. Let's not forget that serendipity, and I didn't talk about it, but serendipity is that idea of organizing in a gentle way unexpected encounters. So how do we organize that clever people meet each other? That's the key. How do we make sure that people bump into each other and have that additional innovation? That is about density, a function of density and diversity. So we need to densify. Densification is not the same as high-rise. I think we have a lovely tradition in Europe of building buildings which are around 5 to 7 stories high. That's an almost ideal density for cities. We don't need to go 70 meters plus everywhere. But let's really focus on that mixed use with the right amount of people to make sure that we create pressure on public space, that we don't design lovely public spaces for no one. And let's together stop selling for the status quo. And I think that's what you guys are doing here with the Nordic City Making Week. We need to keep being rebellious when we think about the future of cities. Thank you very much.